morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us today and welcome to this Community Near Fault Observatory breakout session on measuring near field transient and secular strain accumulation and release along fault zones. I'm Casey Adderhold, project manager at EarthScope. The EarthScope consortium is committed to fostering the exchange of scientific ideas by providing a safe, productive, and welcoming environment. All participants are expected to abide by the IRIS Meeting Code of Conduct while we get an EarthScope 1 approved and finalized. Geophysical data collected within rupture zones of significant earthquakes are essential for testing and developing further models of earthquake processes, focusing on in situ observations in the immediate vicinity of fault zones where rocks suffer permanent deformation during faulting events could transform the understanding of earthquake physics, improve ground motion prediction estimates, and contribute to structural engineering efforts to mitigate earthquake impacts. This breakout session is one in a series of sessions intended to gather input from the broader earthquake science community on key research areas, science questions, and the data experiments needed to address them in the near fault zone. This breakout session will be recorded and archived on the IRIS Earthquake Science Presentations YouTube channel, and the discussion held here today will inform future sessions, workshops, and proposals. Should you have a question or comment as the session unfolds, then please clearly and concisely type it into the chat box on your Zoom control panel. If you would like to ask a question or make a comment, you can also raise your hand and we'll call on you in order. At the appropriate times, we'll read your name and question to the presenters. If similar questions have been asked, we may combine or skip them. If the session happens to crash due to Zoom or internet issues, we will reboot it. Just click on the Zoom link again. And automatic captions should be available to be turned on and off on your Zoom control panel. Please message me if they are not able to be activated. To get an idea of the group we have with us today, I'm going to launch a quick poll. Please select your career stage and the type of institution you are currently employed or enrolled in, as well as your prior familiarity and interest in the Community Near Fault Observatory. This poll will remain open until the end of the session. At this time, I'm going to pass this on to Chris to present an introduction and moderate the rest of this session. So Chris, if you want to go ahead and share your slides, and I'll take over on admitting people.
All right, thank you, Casey. We'll get started in a sec.
That looks good.
That's great, yeah. Okay. Yeah, so thank you and welcome everyone to today's breakout session. So this session is part of a series aiming to develop a community near fault observatory, which is called ROSO. My name is Chris Milliner. I'm a postdoc at Caltech, and I'll be moderating this session alongside Roger Bilham. And so as Casey just mentioned, the session is focused on transient near field processes along fault zones and trying to understand how a community near fault observatory can provide new insight into these processes. So just a little bit of background on what ROSO is exactly. It is a community near fault multi-instrumental network of sensors with the intention that it will be installed across a number of major faults in California. So that's really just the San Andreas from Hartfield down almost to the US-Mexico border, and the San Jacinto fault is shown here. Although to note, this is really notional. This is really is still in development, and the main point of this session is to try and understand what you think the network design should look like. So the main the main issue that ROSO is trying to address is a large observational gap in the current seismic and geodetic network. At the moment, most of the stations are located distal to major faults, so more than 1 kilometer away, and this only provides indirect imaging of the source processes. So the aim of ROSO is to instead collect near field, in situ, geophysical and geological data within fault zones where permanent deformation occurs during rupture events. So the idea is to try and collect novel data to try and test existing models, improve earthquake physics and rupture simulations. The proposed instrumentation, as I said, is still in development, but the idea at the moment is to have a number of dense linear arrays oriented across the San Andreas and San Jacinto that are less than 1 kilometer length, spaced about 20-30 kilometers along strike of the faults, with a dense array of sensors within each array. So this is kind of a zoom in here of one of these arrays. And the idea is to have seismometers, accelerometers, GNSS cameras, maybe creep meters and stray meters. This is something that we're going to discuss today as to what these should look like. And so the status of RUSO is that it's currently in the community building phase, and it's being led by EarthScope and SCEC. So today's focus, the idea is we want to try and talk about transient interseismic and post-seismic processes, and how we could better understand those processes using a near-fault observatory. So the aim of the session specifically is to try and identify important science questions, to try and figure out which are the most critical to the community, which transient processes are not well understood, which could address those science questions. So things like transient creep, gas emissions, fault healing, post-seismic afterslip. This is just to name a few. And then in the session, we want to try and figure out what are the types of instrumentation and the geometry and the location that is required to observe these processes, which RUSO could feasibly deliver. And so the idea is to try and get feedback from all of you here today to try and figure out what are the questions, the processes, and the instrumentation. So specifically, some science questions to try and guide the discussion later on today. We want to try and understand what the transient interseismic and post-seismic processes. For example, how do creep events nucleate, propagate, and arrest along faults? What mechanisms and conditions give rise to episodic accelerated creep? How common are gas emissions? Are they systematically associated with creep along faults? What is the magnitude, time, and spatial variability of these signals? So how do they propagate along faults? How fast? What are the durations? How deep do they propagate? Where do they emanate? What can we learn about the frictional properties of faults and other important initial conditions that may affect the eventual larger ruptures on a major fault system? Third, how could we better observe these near-field transient processes using our purpose-built observatory? So hopefully we'll talk about the types of instrumentations that are required and what the setup would look like. And lastly, we want to try and discuss how we can train the next generation of researchers with such a network. So how could we maybe develop, for example, classes or weekend field trips or kind of training exercises to install instruments along these faults? So those are the main questions we want to try and hopefully cover today. The way the session is structured is we have 3 talks. They're about 10 to 12 minutes each. So there'll be a few minutes afterwards for follow-up questions. Following these 3 talks, we'll then have a Q&A for about 30 minutes. So we should be wrapped up in about an hour and a half. So feel free in this discussion to add your input. We would really want to hear from everyone. We want your thoughts on what you think is important, maybe what's not important. So if you want to raise a question or a comment, please raise your virtual hand, or you can submit a question in the chat box, or you can enter a question in the Google Doc. And I think that link should be in the chat box. So that's it for me. I think we'll get started. So I'll now pass it on to Andrea Donnellan. I'll stop sharing, and Andrea can share her screen. So Andrea is a researcher and lab manager at JPL. She's specialized in using radar interferometry with UAV SAR, as well as GNSS, low altitude drone surveying, and numerical modeling to understand the hazard and mechanics of fault systems. Today, Andrew's going to give some insight on what we can learn about trigger creep and afterslip in the salt trough area. So Andrea, thanks for giving us your time, and I'll pass it over to you.
I don't know why that advanced. How do I go backwards? There we go. So I will be talking. I don't know what's going on. Hang on. Here we go. I'll be talking about triggered slip on a network faults, really at the bottom south end of the rupture fault zone observatory. I think, I don't know if you can see my cursor, it's a little bit of an unusual area being in the Salton Trough, but it feeds into all of the faults to the north. So I'll be talking about, here's kind of the punchline, triggered slip that occurred from the magnitude 7.2 El-Merrick-Kukapa earthquake on a network of right lateral and left lateral conjugate faults, stepping up through the Salton Trough and all the way to the San Andreas Fault. That's half part of it. that happened as a result or during the magnitude 7.2 earthquake. The other piece I'll talk about is just north of the rupture, what we observed post-seismically in the area that would feed into the Elsinore fault. These are red because they're slip, or orange. This is blue because slip actually dissipated in this area, which was surprising to me. It wasn't what I was expecting or looking for. So I think most of us know, or all of us know, that the 2010 El-Maricopa earthquake was a magnitude 7.2 earthquake. It ruptured in Mexico up to the southernmost part of the Salton Trough in California. This was the first observation of a large earthquake using NASA's airborne UAV SAR L-band radar instrument. I'll talk about that on the next slide. And we also were able to observe post-seismic motions. We saw, as I mentioned on the last slide, triggered slip on a network of faults all the way up to and including the San Andreas fault. And we saw post-seismic deformation near the north end of the main shock rupture, and that stress dissipated over time. I just put this left panel in here to show you what we proposed for UAV SAR in 2008. So it was a very new instrument. It had its test flights in 2009 and became operational about 6 months before the El-Maricopa earthquake. We expected there could be significant earthquakes in the Salton Trough area, in the LA area, and the Napa area. And in fact, we had earthquakes in all three of these. So that was kind of a win for UAV SAR. This is the radar pod mounted on the belly of a Gulfstream 3 aircraft. It looks sideways, so we see line of sight motion in a 45 degree plus or minus, I don't know, 23 degree angle. By being on an aircraft instead of space, we have some advantages in that it's configurable. We can tailor our flight tracks, and it's higher resolution. So the resolution is about 7 meters on the ground. NISAR, of course, will be systematic and cover the globe, so it will have its own advantages. There's a lot on this slide, but I wanted to show a couple of things. There was southward motion of the Salton Trough because we had right lateral slip on the El-Maricopa earthquake rupture. One of the interesting things that happened is the entire Salton Trough uplifted as a result of the earthquake or during the earthquake. The area to the west flexed downward a little bit, and then we had triggered slip on these blue faults that I've noted here. I just wanted to show you one time series for one of the stations because it's very discontinuous, and I think we have to factor this in a fault zone observatory. The rates aren't consistent between the before the El-Maricopa earthquake, between that earthquake and the Brawley swarm, or after the Brawley swarm. So the rates are very different. The Salton Trough in this area was subsiding. This station is at Brawley effectively. It popped up in the El-Maricopa earthquake. It continued to inflate that area. And then the Brawley swarm caused a downward trend. So there's a lot of nonlinear discontinuous motions in this area that we have to understand. This is the radar interferogram. We have, the swath is about 15 kilometers wide. They're about 90 kilometers long. We have a set of them that go all the way up through the Los Angeles basin, but I wanted to show the south one. Purple is away from the aircraft. The aircraft is flying left or to the west. Purple is away from the aircraft. Yellow is towards. So we have this right lateral motion. And if we look at the co-seismic slip, there were 170 meters wide, but about 50 centimeters of southward motion here. We see that again in the GPS. And red on these icons is uplift, blue is downlift. The arrows show the direction of motion. There are tiny little arrow ellipses you can see on these GPS stations, so it's very precisely measured. And then you can see the nice uniform deformation field we can measure using radar. So NISAR is supposed to launch next January, and we will have excellent coverage globally, although a slightly coarser resolution. So again, here's the triggered slip, and I've added on the interferograms. This one on the Imperial Fault, you can probably see the best, or the Superstition Hills Fault, I'm sorry. We took profiles across there. You can see this slip. There is a little bit of a width of that deformation zone. And here on the, Imperial Fault and Superstition Hill Fault, we have that offset again of about 36 millimeters. This is the main shock rupture. We can see a lot more fringes. The fringes show the amount of motion. So there was a lot there, and there was this triggered slip. It occurs throughout the Salton Trough. It doesn't really occur beyond that. There were both the right lateral faults that I mentioned, as well as the left lateral faults. This is from Jay Parker using UAV SAR, and Roger's on the paper. I'm on the paper. Several other people are. In the paper, he showed that the field measurements can underestimate the slip. I think this was what Chris was getting at. The rupture zones can be, or the deformation zones can be wide. They can be up to 100 meters wide. Here we have slip measured from crete meters, and then we have black lines show the field measurements, and the gray lines show the slip estimated using UAV SAR. So in almost all cases, the slip from UAV SAR is higher. That's because the fault zone is wider. So the field measurements right at the fault aren't capturing that. I actually wanted to put a picture in here, and then I forgot. If you walk out to Painted Canyon, you can actually see cracks in the ground pretty consistently where the San Andreas Fault is. If we compare it to other earthquakes, those are again with field measurements. Again, they underestimate what is being measured with UAV SAR because of this width of the fault zone. The other thing, I think it's on the next slide, is that the surface locking depth of this triggered slip zone is very shallow. It's only 6 to 27 meters, and the shear is distributed. Jay developed an automated edge detection algorithm to analyze the UAV SAR data. Black lines are dextral slip, white lines are sinistral slip. In this panel in the upper right, then, he's calculated the amount of slip across the fault zone. And here's an expansion of it. There are a couple of important things. One is we do see triggered slip on the San Andreas Fault, but there's a lot more triggered slip on a network of faults off the San Andreas Fault, and those can be mapped to the Hidden Springs faults and other faults. And then these blue lines are the U-surf faults. So these earthquakes can produce very complex deformation patterns and off the main fault rupture. We actually saw the same thing in the La Habra earthquake, where we saw triggered slip on surrounding faults as a result of that earthquake. In the post-seismic, we saw in the rupture mostly occurred in Mexico. We saw 1.4 centimeters of right lateral slip up here, 2.4 centimeters of left lateral slip on the Yuha Fault. You can see a little bit of deformation. So this is distance across the field. This is spanning a 79-day time frame. If we look right after the earthquake, then to 7 years, excuse me, after the earthquake, we can add up the post-seismic slip, and we can see deformation here, slip, pretty discrete slip on the Yuha Fault itself. So we had, this is the post-seismic 1.4 centimeters growing to 2.4 centimeters over 7 years, and 2.5 centimeters on the Yuha Fault growing to 5 centimeters over 7 years. It was highly time dependent, but it showed a really nice post-seismic decay. What I was looking for when we started this study was transfer of slip from the El Mayor-Cucaba earthquake up to the Elsinore Fault, the southern end of the Elsinore Fault. But this connecting area that's about 15 kilometers long just dissipated all of the stress instead. So you can see these fractures here on the Yuha Fault and in the Ocotillo section of the fault. Using Jay's edge detection, we can pick out this deformation and measure the amount of slip. And then over time, you see this conjugate growth of these two faults, but they do decay. They fit a logarithmic after slip decay model very well, with a velocity strengthening layer thickness of about 2.2 kilometers. So just to summarize, triggered shallow slip from large earthquakes may be relieving tectonic strain accumulation, so that far field strain accumulation, but it looks like it's very shallow. The El Mayor-Cucaba post-seismic analysis suggests stress dissipation at the north end of the rupture rather than transfer of additional slip and strain onto the Elsinore Fault. That again suggests this far field driving of faults rather than local driving of faults. So some of the questions I pose here, I don't know what those 2 zeros are in line with what Chris was talking about. Does shallow triggered slip indicate active faults? Probably yes. Or can we estimate rate of strain accumulation from that? I don't know why it's doing that. Do faults with triggered slip have different shallow rheology than, say, the San Jacinto fault, which didn't show triggered slip in the earthquake, yet we all know it's an active fault. And then did the far field tectonics drive the fault strain accumulation, or does stress transfer between faults? With there, I will stop.
Okay, thanks, Andrea. That was great. We've got time for a few questions, if there's any from the audience. Let's have a look. Okay, so Duncan Agnew has a question. I can read it out. So for the many slip occurrences that are off the main fault, is shallow less than 30 meters or something deeper?
It's all shallow, as far as we can tell. As the slip gets smaller, it's a little more difficult to tell how deep the locking depth is, because we can't determine the width as well. But it looks like all of this trigger slip is shallow, but it's somehow accumulating strain and then relieving it when it's triggered by these earthquakes. I'm curious if Roger has anything to add.
No, I've got a little bit to say in my talk, so I'll save it till then.
Yeah, and you had a question. So you showed the figure with the width of triggered creep, I think.
Yeah, the San Andreas fault.
Yeah, so the Rosso linear arrays are going to be on the order of hundreds of meters, I think. So is that aperture wide enough, you think, to capture the full width of that triggered creep?
It should. The maximum one there was about 150 meters. On average, it was about 100 meters wide.
Okay.
So few hundred meters should cover it.
Okay.
I could answer a little bit on that. Dermot Hill is rather special because it's basically a sort of an inflated rubber bag. It's not like most of the fault. So I'm not sure that one needs to take Dermot Hill too seriously as a guide to what's going to happen elsewhere.
Although UAV SAR is along 30 kilometers or something, shows the slip. So it's consistently wide. But I agree with you, Roger, that different faults have different rheology. The Southern San Andreas and the San Jacinto faults, I think, are very different.
Right.
Okay. Another question I had, Andrea, was in Jay's figures, you showed some kind of distributed faults or fractures in the UAV SAR. Because I know with UAV SAR you can have some tropospheric delays. Is it possible some of those edge detections are picking up like topography related to troposphere, or do you think those are all real fractures? I mean, have they been ground truthed?
We showed the ones that were ground truthed on that plot. Okay. Typically, the atmospheric errors are broader. They're longer wavelengths. So he does have, you do have to fine tune it, and he has to make some determination about what is an edge that he thinks is realistic and what's not. So it's a little bit circulator and picking the width of the fault, right?
Because I mean, some have some really strange orientations.
But they could be. Well, I'll let you talk in a second, Roger. They could be topographically driven. There could be slumps and other things that are showing up as edges. A lot of those do map to some of the faults, though. Roger, what were you going to say?
I was going to say exactly that. Dermot Hills is a sort of terrible mass of transpressive folding and fracturing, and a lot of those features that look weird are actually they appear on the ground and you do walk over them. But it is a very unusual kind of fault zone because it's been squeezed. I mean, it's a sort of flower structure we're looking at from above. So it's a kind of mess compared to, say, the San Jacinto, which is, it's got rock on both sides.
Okay. Let's see, are there any other questions from the audience?
Yeah, I just want to comment one more time that in terms of the rupture fault zone observatory, the Salton Trough is driving all the deformation in the north, so you do have to understand it. But I also think it's different than the faults to the north.
Okay. I don't see any other. Let's see. Okay, we got one more from Yehuda. The aperture of the Rosso is currently planned to be 3.5 kilometers. Okay, so the comment. Okay, sounds good. All right, thank you.
Should be good.
Okay, thanks, Andrea. So I think we'll move on to the next talk. So next we have Roger Bilham. Roger is a professor at University of Colorado Boulder. Roger's made a number of contributions in understanding a range of faulting processes from co-seismic slip, post-seismic afterslip, triggered creep, so slip events. So Roger's going to be talking about creep along faults in California, and perhaps how we could be doing a better job of measuring them with something like RUSO. So Roger,
can you see my screen? Can you see my screen? Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's good.
All right. So there are basically two end members for viewing California. Is that black bar on the screen, or is that only on my screen?
We are not
see
seeing
your
a black
cursor.
bar, but you can hit the green circle if you want to go full screen.
The green circle. Okay, got it. Okay, fine.
Okay.
The fault zone on the left is, I call a sleeping fault. In other words, fault not doing anything until an earthquake happens at depth. And when that occurs, the shallow fault starts responding either in the form of creep at depth or afterslip at the surface. Essentially, the signal from a fault on the left is driven from below, whereas the fault on the right is a creeping fault that is driven by antisymmetric shear of some sort. And in that case, maximum creep tends to happen on the surface and propagate downwards towards the seismogenic zone. In other words, it loads the seismogenic zone. So we're really looking at faults on the left that are really doing nothing. And so the question is, what can we measure on a fault that's doing essentially nothing? Well, the answer is quite a bit. First of all, fault zones tend to focus stuff coming up from the mantle. There's many articles in the 1980s that people don't look at very much now, from Irwin and Barnes and other people, geochemists. They noticed that CO2 is concentrated globally near fault zones, and they actually point out that if in fact these fault zones are being stressed, then the permeability may well change with time, allowing gases to come up preferentially in great big gulps. Now, Jim Rice quantified this a bit by looking at the processes that might be involved, and he came to the same sort of conclusion that pore fluids may start at the base of the seismogenic zone and work their way up to the surface. It's not just CO2, of course, it also applies to can't advance. What happened here? Okay. It also applies to helium. And if you look at the ratio of helium-3 and helium-4 on coming out of boreholes, you find that there's well, Kennedy and others have found that there's a marked concentration of these gases coming out close to the fault, and it sort of tails off with distance from the fault. Now, the problem with this kind of sampling is that they're restricted to boreholes because they communicate quickly with what's happening at depth, so there's no dispersal going on. So it's a bit of a problem. And one of the questions one might ask is, well, does gas really come out of the fault zones, or is it coming out all over the place? Well, we had a bit of a clue from an earthquake recently in Turkey. This was the Sivrice earthquake in January 2020. And a few days after the earthquake, geologists noticed that there were bubbles, lines of bubbles coming out of the Euphrates River, and that they aligned with what appeared to be on echelon cracks, just like you see at the surface. So here's an earthquake, a magnitude 6.8, releasing masses of gas for a week or so. And this gives rise to a number of questions like, does gas come out of the San Andreas creeping fault during creep events, or does it in fact facilitate creep? More interestingly, we know earthquakes release gas, but does gas nucleate earthquakes within the seismogenic zone? So there's sort of interesting questions. Now, the problem with measuring gas is that it's awfully difficult. You go into a field, a field of cows, and you say, well, where am I going to measure gas? The geochemists have come up with these absurd tools. One is just to shove a probe into the ground to measure the gas concentration. The other is to put a kind of hemispherical dome like a garbage can over the ground facing downwards, and they pump air through it, or pump the gases and circulate it through their detector. And then they hope that this is measuring some element of the gas flux, the amount of gas coming from the ground into the air. And of course, this process only works because diffusion is occurring between what's inside and what's outside. And there's this kind of iffy region where you don't really know what's happening at all. So I really don't trust these methods. I don't know anything better. We came up with the thing on the right, which is basically a tube plugged into the ground about 3 feet overlying a bed of gravel. We put a hemispherical bowl at the bottom. You have a little fan that sucks the gases from the bottom to the top and vents them out to the surface. And the detectors are now much easier to make than they were 20, 30 years ago. We measure carbon dioxide, hydrogen, methane, and various other things. Radon turns out to be very easy to measure now. You can get Bluetooth radon gadgets. You just walk up to the sensor and download it. Now, what do you measure? Here's one of the sites that we've measured gas for a couple of years now. It's actually in Milliner, which is used quite a lot in the 1970s and 80s as a test bed. The creep signal is this red line here, and you can see creep events followed by slow slip, creep event, and so on. The first thing to notice is that the green and the blue lines, that's radon is green, blue is carbon dioxide. They sort of match each other. There are places where one instrument isn't working, one gets clipped and so on. But the important thing to notice is that the levels of these gases are enormously higher than you might expect. Here, the radon level in January 22 went up to beyond 100 picocuries per cubic per liter. This is about 25 times higher than the safe level that you're supposed to have in your basement. So this is not a place to hang out at all. Also, the carbon dioxide levels, you'll notice 4,000 parts per million, whereas it's about 400 in the atmosphere. Do these gases increase at the time of creep events? Actually not synchronously in any way. What we see is a creep event may occur. At the beginning of the record, there's a couple of creep events, the red upsurges here, and we see a radon or a hydrogen burst or a carbon dioxide burst a few days later. This happens actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times during this record. And some clue about what might be happening is seen in the sort of springtime of 2021. Here there's a burst of carbon dioxide and radon and no apparent creep event nearby. Now, we were in the field wondering about this, and we noticed that a whole bunch of en-echelon cracks had opened. These are desiccation cracks due to the drying out of the soils in the fault zone. So one possible thing that's happening is that when desiccation cracks appear, they penetrate down into the subsurface and allow gases to vent. I'm not going to show any more of these records, but I think they're important because they may well tell us about what's going on at depth. How fast does gas come to the surface? One clue came from the Calaveras fault, where we have a creep meter overlying a bunch of microseismicity. The microseismicity went past, a creep event happened a few weeks later, and we hypothesized that the microseismicity in some way started gases rising from depths of around about 5 kilometers, and they took about 5 weeks to get to the surface. In other words, these gases are arriving about 1 kilometer per week, which is equivalent to 6 meters per hour, which is a lot slower than the lateral propagation of dislocations responsible for creep on the San Andreas fault, which is about 2 kilometers per hour. So how do you find where to put your gas monitoring? Well, the clue may come from a surprising source. In Europe, they find that red ants or redwood ants, these are not redwood ants, by the way, these things aren't, the redwood ants are not here. They are confined to Europe, but they're 8 times more likely to build their nests within 60 meters of a geological fault. Now, these are not active faults, but clearly the ants prefer their nests there because of the gases coming out of the fault zones, that maybe methane or carbon dioxide, whatever. And there are certain types of plant, as we know, that prefer fault zones. So we may have to be imaginative about how to find suitable places to measure gas. Now, I'm going to move on. Some advances in creep measurement have occurred in the last few years. The instrument on the right, on the left, is a black line obliquely placed across a fault. And it's the typical way in which creep has been measured everywhere for the last 50 years. Essentially, you have a scalar measurement of what is, in fact, we now know to be a vector process. So a few years ago, we started putting in instruments like the middle one, where we have an oblique instrument supplemented by an instrument at right angles to the fault. And we're measuring now the opening of the fault as well as its slip. I'll show you some data in a minute. And on the right is the latest offering, where we have a much more complex system where we're, instead of just measuring the vector, we're trying to measure the strain tensor across the fault. In other words, this isn't a single strain tensor, but in fact, a spatial variation in the shear strain as you go across the fault, because we now know that fault creep is a 3-dimensional process, and that there is a very tough layer near the surface that impedes the manifestation of nice clean cracks like we would expect from a mobile dislocation. Okay, so what do we measure with these things? Well, that middle creep meter gave us a lot of insight. This is a plot of one location. This is one of Heather Shaddox's creep meters at Fox Creek on the San Andreas. And what we're plotting is the orthogonal opening of the fault vertically versus the dextral slip of the fault horizontally. And what you can see is that when the fault has a creep event, which is where these are data acquired at hourly intervals, each circle is an hour apart. So when there's a creep event, a very rapid slip of the fault opens. So the fault, as one might expect it to do, dilates when it slips. And then in the 1 or 2 months following the creep event, the fault collapses slowly back to its original level. The next creep event widens it again, and so on. And one of the interesting things that we've noticed is that when you get a lot of rain, something weird happens. You get what appears to be a sinistral slip of the fault. Well, that turns out to be easily explainable. Here's a view of the details of one of these. This is a Melendi Ranch again. Here is a creep event, but about a week before this creep event, you can see there's heavy rain and the fault appeared to go backwards. And in fact, the fault zone shrank in width by almost 3 millimeters. Now, this requires a little bit of explanation, because most people have criticized creep measurements as being rubbish, because when it rains, the fault zone expands and you get all sorts of nonsense occurring. Well, what's actually happening is the fault zone is not expanding, it's contracting, which is kind of weird. The gouge, the different clays in the fault zone are clearly expanding, but what's happening is there's some readjustment in the fault zone that's occurring during heavy rain. We have a kind of model for explaining this. Essentially, we're imagining the fault to be foliated. There's a lot of evidence that all faults that are creeping are in fact foliated. So there's an alignment of clasts that are oblique to the fault zone. When you get fault slip and there's friction between these clasts, they rotate in a way that opens up the fault. So a rapid slip will produce dilation. And if you lubricate that region of dilated fault by saturating it with an atmospheric river, you collapse the fault. And during the period of time between creep events, something similar occurs, the clasts rotate back to their relaxed, well-packed condition, all on their own, or rather with the help of normal forces on the flanks of the fault. So this kind of explains why creep meters sometimes give weird answers. Now, I'm going to focus the rest of my talk on what we might do in this new observatory environment. One of the things that we don't understand very well at all at the moment is what we call triggered slip. This is when an earthquake happens on one fault, and Andrea gave us a long talk on that just now. Earthquake happens on a nearby fault, and slip instantly happens on faults within a few hundred kilometers of that. And what you see on a creep meter is very often a rapid jump of a fraction of a millimeter. And of course, the concern is that this might well be an artifact of the instrument, something to do with bad coupling of the instrument to the fault zone. On the other hand, it could well be something real. For example, here's an example of afterslip. Andrea showed this slide before. This was the magnitude 8.2 Chiapas earthquake at a distance of 1,000 kilometers from the southern San Andreas. It went through a little jump, which you can't actually see on this figure. And then in the next 2 or 3 months, a sequence of propagating dislocations traveled up and down the fault. So the first pulse traveled northwards, and after a few weeks, there was a second pulse between 2 of the instruments, and then a few weeks later, a third pulse of slip propagated southwards. Yes, southwards. So what you can see here is a small amount of slip, but this is a destabilizing effect on the fault. This is clearly not instrumental. It's something that happens on the fault, and we'd like to know more about this kind of process. It could have been caused by pore pressure changes in the fault zone, or some kind of small slip event at depth that propagated at the surface. Let's talk about afterslip. Afterslip is almost ubiquitous on California's faults after a moderate earthquake. Here's the Park Field region. John Langbine's processed data from a dozen or so creep meters in the Park Field region, and you can see that there's a background creep. Suddenly the earthquake occurs. There's a rapid slip, which is not shown well on these figures. Sometimes it's actually missing from the creep meter, as I'll explain. And then there's an afterslip process that takes 3 or 4 years and until the fault resumes its background creep rate. Or does it? Have a look at this figure on the right. This is the same thing now in log time space. So we're looking at decades of increasing time. So here's 1/10 of a day, 1 day, 10 days, 100 days. And as much slip occurs in one of these decades, say in the first hour, as in the next 10 hours, as in the next 100 hours, and so on. So if you look now at the Park Field region as a complete system, a 20 or 30 year period of earthquakes occurring followed by afterslip, what you find is there's about 7 decades of time, and most creep meters are off scale for the first day or two. So you're missing in most creep meters at this point miss out on most of the action in the first hour or 2 or 3 days until you get them back on scale. And so most afterslip studies have been done starting from 3 days after the earthquake to perhaps a year after the earthquake. Well, that's essentially 3 days to 300 days, which is enough to define these afterslip curves. So let's have a look at what people do with this. Oh yes, before I say that, one of the problems is if you're losing data just here, you lose a lot of information. And so we started putting in creep meters that can capture both background creep and the coseismic slip and after slip simultaneously. And they look a bit like this. I won't bore you with the details. Essentially, there's a very thin wire wrapped around a drum here. That drum is held by a spring, which unwraps at constant tension. The wire goes around a transducer, is attached to a carbon fiber rod. The carbon fiber rod essentially has got enough strength to pull a battleship. It's enormously tough, and it goes through the fault zone within a plastic conduit. So the idea is that when the fault moves, this entire system moves within the pipe, and it rotates all these. There's 10 ball bearings and systems in here. The important thing about this type of instrument is that it can resolve a couple of microns of slip of the fault, and also accept slip of up to, and in this case, 1.7 meters, although we can make them with much larger range if needed. So here's a handful of after slip curves. I'm not going to go into the details because none of them work. Most studies of after slip are interesting, and they attempt to tell us something about the rheology of the fault zone, but none of these equations work, largely because after slip is not a homogeneous process. Here's an example. This is the Sivriati earthquake again. You can see 5 months of data following the earthquake. The creep meter was installed here, and the main shock occurred here. Was a 6.8, and here's a 5.5 that restarts the after slip curve. So if you try to fit the whole after slip curve, you start running into problems. But there are smaller problems with even this starting segment of the after slip. You can see little jumps here corresponding to 4.5 earthquakes nearby, and these are little patches of the fault slipping, initiating their own aftershock type after slip process. So it's almost impossible to come up with a single curve that's explaining what's happening, unless you model each of these little patches and do the job properly. Now, missing from this is something that will come as a bit of a surprise to most of you. You'll notice the creep meter goes in here, and this is 0 ground slip. And if you project that to the time 0, you don't hit the main shock at all. The main shock slip point is down here somewhere. So let's look at this in log time. Here is the same curve now. There's that 5.1 after shock. Here's the main shock after decay curve from 1 million seconds to 10 million seconds, essentially. Now we can fit this to a nice exponential curve, and it predicts what's going on when the instrument wasn't there. And what does it predict? Well, it tells you that after slip is starting, obviously, shortly after the main shock at depth, and it's tunneling its way to the surface. It only emerges at the surface about 2 days after the main shock. So this is something we've known about for ages, but this is kind of an interesting region. It's a kind of mystery region where things are going on, which we can't measure at the surface, but we can if we use the right kind of instrument. And well, okay, let me get to a sort of wrap-up session. What would we do if we had limitless money and we wanted to answer a whole bunch of questions about a fault that's doing essentially nothing between big earthquakes? Well, one is to go for, you absolutely need this. This is the sort of primary target. This is the bus that we're waiting for. Essentially, we need to capture coseismic slip, and we need to capture this mysterious subsurface slip before it arrives at the surface, and we need to measure after slip. So we need a rupture meter of the sort that I just showed you, and perhaps we'd like one of these deflectometer instruments that can measure the approach of the slip towards the surface, because that's telling us a lot about the fault zone rheology in the early part of the after slip. The second thing we'd like to do is to answer this question about triggered slip, which I alluded to. There are a whole bunch of questions we can ask if we have the right kind of equipment, and perhaps the right kind of equipment will be something like this segmented creep meter that can measure the variation in the arctan function across the fault zone because that's telling us whether triggered slippage are happening on the surface or in the subsurface, and whether it tunnels its way to the surface subsequently. In terms of gas measurements, I've described the simple kind of gas measuring devices that one can use. Most gas measurements on fault zones hitherto have used sampling systems that measure a data point per day or per week or even per month. We can easily make instruments that measure gas emanations at minute intervals. It doesn't cost any more at all. What's important, and something that's not yet resolved, is to work out what kind of array across the fault and along the fault we need. Two other things that I haven't mentioned but which could be done is to look at the effects of loading of the fault. So we've got a passive fault, but we are loading it either with distant forces like atmospheric loading or whatever. But here I'm showing you an example of what happens if you have a dry season water table that's coupled to the surface. Suddenly you get an additional load that's applied to the top of the water table, which effectively induces stresses that can produce hydrofracture. Well, we don't expect to get hydrofracture occurring because of that, but what we might see is some influence on the width of the fault zone. Essentially, we might be able to work out some of the parameters of the rheology of the fault zone from these passive forces. And finally, something that can be done. I mean, it's kind of dull, but that's what graduate students are for. Essentially, to look at the effect of loads, regional loads like low tides, solid earth tides, and the response of the fault zone to seismic waves, which is probably more interesting. Effectively, there we need a tensor array of instruments across the fault, operating with very high precision. We need at least 10⁻⁹ strain sensitivity with faults in the flank at the same time. And what one would do is compare the flank strain with the across fault strain and see whether that's stable with time. So there's a handful of things one can do on a fault that's essentially asleep. Some of them are essential for the whole purpose of the observatory is to capture what happens during co-seismic slip. But while we're waiting, this is a bit like things to do in Denver when you're dead. You can measure all these other things. Okay, over to you.
All right, thanks, Roger. That was really great. There's a lot of interesting stuff there. Are there any questions from the audience? We only really have time for one, I think. If not, that's okay. We got time for discussion after. I think we should maybe move on. So thank you, Roger. So up next, we have Dave Mencin. Dave is Director of Geodetic Studies at UNAVCO and a researcher scientist at Ceres. Dave's current efforts involve earthquake and tsunami warning systems in the Western US. This also includes deployment of next generation strain meters to study earthquakes and volcanic processes, where he's also installed strain meters along a number of faults, including the North Anatolian Fault below the Sea of Marmara near Istanbul. So Dave is going to present some recent work using a new fiber optic strain meter that can be deployed in boreholes, which is something that could have potential use in something like Rosta. So Dave, welcome, and I'll pass it over to you.
All right, make sure I'm not muted. Well, Chris, I'm only going to talk about the strain meters briefly, just because and I'm going to talk about what you can do with them mostly. The big. I'll just start talking my side. So I guess what I took away from this, and the motivation behind this talk, was this from this white paper that we gave to RUPSO, I don't know, a couple of years ago, about what we can do in between the earthquakes as well as during the earthquakes. And I just copied this paragraph, and I'll keep moving on. so we have more time to discuss it. I have a few slides just talk about history here. So like Chris said, my group has installed 113 or 14 of these worldwide. These were older generation borehole strain meters, very sensitive, but very expensive, roughly $300,000 per installation. So you can do the math on how much money we spent. What I'm excited about for things like this, because that limited what we could do with those strain meters, obviously, is this instrument was developed by Scott DeWolf from Scripps now at Clemson. It's a passive downhole sensor. It's wrapped fiber optics, so it's basically a giant interferometer squeezed into a small tube, and when you squeeze it, it changes the different lengths. It has a 0.1 picostrain resolution. Scott says we could get it down to less than 3 inches in diameter, which is hugely important for the installation cost. And it's single trip deployment. If anybody's really interested in how we do this, that makes things a lot easier when we're not going up and down the hole. We have put a handful of these in, so they have been built, they're not fiction. And we have put them in with our older instruments, the GTSM instruments. So this is where we put 3 instruments, 2 of the TOFs and 3 GTSM instruments in a injection well in Oklahoma. And you can see here the black line is the GTSM, the old one that costs roughly $300,000, and the red line is the TOFs, the new one, which costs much like, on order $50,000 for the entire installation. So much cheaper. And then this blue line is a difference. So now the difference between these two, we actually interpret is that the instruments are working almost exactly the same. We have not, the difference is really driven by the reservoir difference, which Scott and his team are trying to use to characterize the reservoir, because these are roughly 500 meters apart in a reservoir that we know is different at that scale. So what we've done with these strain meters over the years is, this was part of the Plate Boundary Observatory, and before that it was part of the USGS, is we put them all, there's a whole bunch of them, 50 some along the San Andreas Fault now, but they're not, one, they did take low frequency data, and 2, they aren't really optimally spaced to get at what we're talking about, creep. So this is just an example of what we've been doing with them. We've captured a few earthquakes, been able to invert for them. This is the 2010 magnitude 5.4 in San Jacinto. Again, John Langbein started trying to use these to see creep events, but you can see here on this 2-year record, there was 3 significant creep events that this strain meter saw. But again, when you blow this up, you can see that there's not a lot of structure to here. So what we've been doing is looking at this data this was 10-minute data or 5-minute data. So we've been blowing up these creep events into collecting the data at much higher sample rates. So we're trying to get an idea of what these creep events look like, how they propagate, even though we have limited observation. So on the right is what we're seeing now at 20 Hertz. So it's the same creep event, but now you can see a lot of structure to that creep event signal. So what I was motivated by here is to see what we could try and image with creep events at very high resolution, both in time and strain field. So, we unfortunately, when we put all these borehole strain meters in, again, they're not optimized. Only a handful of them see creep events that are small. They usually only see big earthquakes. So we did hone in on this area where we have 3 creep meters and 1 strain meter. The strain meter does see creep events, and this is all on roughly 1 kilometer spacing scale. So about the scale we're talking about in RUFSO, and try and develop a model. So this inversion here on the bottom was the static inversion for one of those creep events, roughly 1 millimeter slip image on the same thing. And so what we've done is tried to recover that signal, that funny looking signal we started. So we went ahead and have segmented the fault into lots of little pieces, and then we moved the little pieces along the fault, trying to right now we're talking about a forward model to see if we can generate things that look like that creep event that I just showed you. So each one of these segments that we put in time source functions, just like a seismologist would. Of course, we are choosing time source functions that have physical basis, because we're looking at things slow enough. We can't use sawtooth functions and whatnot. So we're using, in this case, we're using a Brune function. So each patch is associated with a moment source function and a start time. And then when we build these forward models, you can see they look almost exactly like what we observe on the creep. So we're, again, motivated to try and build a model to describe this, so we can generate synthetic creep events. I'll talk about this in a minute. But these almost match up perfectly. So we, even with a forward model, we're starting to, this is only a 100-meter patch that's slipping 1 millimeter. You can see the bottom one looks almost exactly the same. Actually, the difference is completely driven by the orientation. My model is perfectly north-south, and if you rotate it 45 degrees, because strain has that funny shape to it, you'll get the same shape that you have here on the bottom from this point. And this is a real creep event. You see a little earthquake that happened right after it. And again, I just have another picture of what this all looks like in 3 dimensions, as if these little red dots are stream meters as we pass creep events at different depths. And I didn't want to, this talk could go on forever. Like, even with 1 stream meter, observing a creep, you can constrain its depth, meaning you can constrain that it happened above or below a specific distance, actually above or below its orthogonal distance to the fault. So you could say it was above that line or below it, even with 1 stream meter. And then, of course, you can determine whether it was moving left or right, and how fast it was moving with just 1 observable or 1 instrument. Of course, what we would want is a bunch of instruments to get that even better. And this is that same model trying to constrain this particular creep event and the 3 creep meters into a slip rate, the cumulative slip, and again, you can see our synthetic versus observed at the bottom. The important part on this particular work we're trying to do is we're trying to parameterize these creep events. So we have an average omega, which is its frequency content, and an average velocity and a start time. And what's been motivating all this, because we don't have lots of observation, is trying to generate lots and lots of synthetic creep events so that we can turn around and train classifiers to, 1, go back to the creep meters, which have been really difficult to identify creep events unless they're really big, and the stream meters. We have lots of data now, almost 30, 40 years of data, and try and pick out more creep events. And as a preliminary result, and I won't say that this is not published, I went back to 1 of the creep meters and used this synthetic model and identified creep events and filtered on a particular omega. I mean, the frequency context around a big earthquake. And you can see at least this preliminary result. I'm going to be careful to say preliminary because I got to really dig into this. The frequency content, the behavior of the creep changed before and after the earthquake. So those little red dots or little red crosses are creep events that had that particular frequency, and then afterwards they changed. The different frequency became dominant. Other things that we could see if we had lots of creep meters and stream meters is, the fine-tuned behavior or the fine scale behavior of these creep events at high temporal resolution, and start getting, this is, when I say lab, these are almost identical to what Chris Marone sees in the lab, and we're starting to see things that look the same as the lab in the field. And this in particular is about 4 different creep events over a span of 3 years. There's more of them in here. I just picked them so you can see different. This particular section of the fault has this strange behavior of starting and stopping, or we don't really know. It could be jumping some part that doesn't creep and starting to creep later on. But this is a repeatable behavior on this particular part of the fault, where a creep event starts, it either stops and starts again, or potentially jumps some zone that isn't creeping and starts again on the other side. With one creep meter, you can't tell, or with one stream meter, you can't tell. If we had several stream meters, we'd start be able to see all this sort of starting and stopping behavior of these small creeping patches. So what could we do with this? And I'm trying to keep this fast because I think we need to talk about this. This study that I'm talking about, which is still in process, was to build a model to parameterize these creep events in multiple domains based on real world intelligence, not AI. And then we have about 75 creep events from the real world that we're using to build this model. Unfortunately, like I said, the creep meters were not deployed in a way to observe small scale creep like this. And then develop synthetic labeled data sets so we can train with the real labeled data sets, train classifiers to go and look at all these decades of creep meter event and all the stream meter event and any future stream meter event data that we have. And how would this benefit the community near fault observatory, or RUPSO, since I've been told the name has not been decided yet. If we include a dense array of geodetic wavelength instrumentation in these small patches, or even not all of them, just a few of them, we'll strengthen the proposal, like Roger pointed out, and then that we'll observe this patch of the quiescent patch of the fault in between. So we'll get a picture of the entire earthquake cell. And then I think there's a lot of innovative science that would strengthen the proposal while we wait. Like if we can really start imaging how at least in my mind, the fault has little patches that are creeping on and off, maybe repeaters even. There's a lot of behavior that is really tantalizing. I mean, for instance, there's one particular type of creep event we see that always has a little earthquake right after it. What's going on there? Like the creep event goes, little earthquake, and that's on one particular. I interpret these different shapes as different places on a fault. It's hard to tell with one stream meter, but that patch does that. This other patch starts and stops. Like, what does this all look like, and how does it impact fault mechanics, even related to the to lab work that's going on, and then all the way up to when earthquakes happen? And then what would this require? Like, what would it require us to do? And I just threw something on the table. So these are much cheaper. So for the cost of 2 of our old stream meters, we could put 10 to 15 of these new stream meters in and start looking at a really get a lot of strong observations around one particular place in the fault. And then I would complement it with 10 to 15 rupture meters at the surface to constrain what goes on the surface. And so we're talking about $1 million for that effort. That's all I got for this, Chris.
All right, thanks, Dave. That's great. Super interesting to see these really small signals come out of these stream meters. We're imaging less than 1 millimeter from kilometers away at high temporal resolution. 100 square meters, 1 millimeter. Right. So there's a comment from John Landine. He says, if I recall, for the 2009 event at Parkfield, there are data from other nearby dilatometers, more constraints than just a single PVO instrument.
Yes, he's totally right. Except I was focused on using the shear strains because they are what drives that shape, right? When the shear strain field propagates by, you get a lot of pluses and negatives in the strain field as it propagates by. The dilatometers are measuring an aerial strain, which doesn't have that feature in it, right? So it's just one pulse of the strain. So I was concentrating on recovering structure from steer strain because that's what I use when I only have one instrument to figure out how things are moving around, because it has that complicated shape when it propagates by.
Well, you do get a dipole situation with the dilatometer. So there's information there that helps constrain the problem. So, and they're also, given that the dilatometers have been around in Parkfield since the 80s, there are probably a lot of events that you could go back and look at in more detail.
Agreed, John. The biggest problem with the old dilatometers is we only collected 5-minute data. So you can constrain like the sort of the big picture of it, like you showed me originally, but trying to understand the propagation is a little hard. But yes, I agree with you 100%.
Okay, are there any other questions for Dave? We're also going to open this up for general discussion too for all the speakers, or any other questions in general about Rosso. Now's the time to bring it up. So we've got less than about 30 minutes for general discussion. So we welcome any comments or questions.
Well, I'll go ahead. This is based on the looking at the questions in the Google Doc, and I think there's one question that has to be put in there very importantly, and that is, how do we design this thing so it will run for the next 50 years? And that includes allowing for the vagaries of funding, because you know, I think many of us have experienced this fault is ready to go, and we're still waiting. So for this to work, it's going to have to run for a very long time. And the worst possible outcome is to spend a huge amount of money and then have the whole thing turned off after 10 years. And that may remind you of a certain program that ended about 5 years ago. But I don't know. And I have no idea how to answer that question short of Elon Musk deciding that he needs to throw $1 billion at it and he will endow it, but or someone else perhaps. But you know, that issue has to be taken into account. It's very discouraging. I won't deny it.
Well, I think, you know, the kind of motivation of the session was to understand, you know, what processes that we could resolve interseismically on the southern parts of the San Andreas fault that have triggered creep events. And so obviously not the entire fault system isn't doing that. So maybe one thing could be, you know, there could be maybe more of a focus down there over the long term as the network's built out. And then the other aspect is trying to use it as an educational and training tool. So using parts of this network to train students and postdocs and grad students. So that was kind of one of the other arguments that came up. But yeah, it's a big challenge, and that's, you know, kind of part of the discussion we want to try and get going today.
So Duncan is absolutely right. This type of observatory, we need to think on timescales of decades. It must run for decades, not 50 years, in order to really benefit from it. You know, so what we hope to do, Duncan, we don't have a solution. We hope that some agency, the state of California or USGS, will be willing after if we manage to, and we are discussing it with them. It's not just a hope, leaving it empty, you know, in the future. But the idea is that we would try to run it for a decade, maybe 10 years, and then, as I said, the state of California, CGS, USGS in combination will absorb it and continue to operate it, because you're absolutely correct. If we put it on the ground and then 10 years from now, somebody pulls the plug on the funding, you know, we haven't done anything. So we are aware of this. We don't have a solution. We are working on it. Suggestions are welcome. How do we get sustained?
Well, then I'll offer my other comment, which is actually not a partial answer to that question is, how do, and this is where Roger is an absolute expert, is how do we keep the operating cost as lower than we could believe to be possible?
Yes, that's absolutely right, Duncan. I've watched your absolutely brilliant, marvelous instruments die completely unnecessarily because you can't afford to pay the electricity bill or whatever. You know, it's so sad. So yeah, I've managed to keep the arrays that I'm running going by basically making them run on disposable batteries to operate for a year unattended, and to not publish anything because I can't afford the publication charges. I mean, essentially that is how you do a zero-sum operating array. And I don't know how possible it will be to do, you know, these more complex things. Certainly the things I've described, except the last two, are possible to do on a shoestring. But there's one other thing that I think a missing ingredient that hasn't been mentioned, and that's the enthusiasm quotient. Unless you have something interesting for students to do, they're not going to want to do it. I mean, it's sort of interesting walking along the fault and saying this is moving. You can't actually see it moving, but look at the numbers whizzing by on my voltmeter. That's sort of limited in excitement, wow value. And I think one possibility is that one may have to admit that one will want the array to evolve with time. As you know, to keep people interested, you need to say, okay, yeah, if you want to improve it, here's $50. You can run it for the next year with your newly revised idea of running it. So, I mean, there are ways of doing it, but there are some things that are going to be still very expensive. For example, a question for Dave, how reliable are the interferometry drivers for the optic fiber strain meters? Over to you, Dave.
Well, Rod, yep, I got it. It remains to be seen. I mean, they're deployed and they've been running for 4 or 5 years. But it's true, like it will never. Well, one, Duncan, to add on to you, Roger, we can't forget the sheer willpower that you're putting into keeping it. We'll never be as cheap as Roger Bilham. That came out the wrong way, but you know what I mean, Roger. But yeah, it's a huge thing. And I think one of the things we should talk about is like, what science can we do while we're waiting for the earthquake? Because that keeps people interested. And that's what I was trying to get with, like maybe some geodesy can answer some questions we know we don't have to wait for the earthquake for if we look at the creep events in between and try and determine fault mechanics and whatnot. It gives us publications and things for graduate students and professors to be interested in while we're waiting for this big earthquake. But Duncan, I have no idea how to answer that question. What we're talking about are the seismometers we're talking about, the accelerometers, the strain meters, everything but the creep meters have lots of data. So they have, and they're complicated instruments that will require not just maintaining them for decades, but replacing them occasionally.
Mm.
Oh, I just want to restate my question to Andrea the first time. You said the creep is shallow, but I was looking for a number. Like when you say it's shallow, do you mean tens of meters, hundreds of meters?
Tens of meters.
Tens of meters.
Yeah, the answer came out of Jay Parker's study. Very often the arctan function was 100 meters. And you and I know that's divided by 4, you've got the depth. So 25 meters. And if you now look at some of the work that Ben Brooks and Josie Nevitt have been doing, they're coming up with similar numbers for this tough carapace over the faults that they're looking at with LiDAR. Essentially, it looks as though that this tough surface layer may in fact simply be the depth of the water table. In other words, below the water table, we have one rheology, and then in the shallow surface, we have something completely different. And it's unfortunate, but that's where we are doing the measurements. So we have to be able to look down below that. And that's why I'm sort of excited about these additional, the deflectometer thing that I described, essentially looking at the arctan function, measuring that rather than trying to measure a scalar component of slip.
So I have a follow-up on that, Roger, because the San Jacinto fault didn't show any triggered slip as far as we know. And the water table is not at the surface, so there's something else. It's bedrock there, is that the difference? I mean, what?
No, I think a lot of, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, the San Jacinto fault has got a lot of rock right next to it, whereas most of the San Andreas fault is basically sponge.
Okay. Look skeptical, Yehuda. You're just thinking.
No, I mean, I just want to say that there's a lot of work on measuring temporal changes of seismic velocities, and we get essentially quasi-universal changes, daily and seasonal changes and the best depths for where they occur is essentially the top 20 kilometers, 10 to 20 meters. So the very shallow crust, almost everywhere, it's not limited even to the fault. The very shallow crust has these properties that it's failing all the time. I'm not surprised it fails by triggered creep as well. So we don't, the point is, there are a couple of comments I want to make. There are lots of signals we don't understand, and we will never understand if we don't get the data, A. B, while we are waiting for big earthquakes, we heard just in this virtual meeting, many interesting signals. There were plenty in Roger's talk that we could try to measure geodetically, and in your talk, David, in Andrea's talk, but also ground motion occurs all the time while we are waiting for big earthquakes. And in previous virtual sessions, people, Gail Atkinson and others pointed out that it's highly valuable. The moderate earthquakes that we get are highly valuable. There is a lot we don't know. It's not only the big earthquakes. But that all leads us back to Duncan's question. And we are fully aware, or point, it's not a question. We are fully aware that there's no point planning something like this with a plan for 5 years or even 10 years. So how do we work on the longevity, the long-term? How do we get a commitment that this will continue to operate? We need buy-in from government, state or federal government agency, or else, there's no point, kind of. It still would be interesting. We had some arrays on the San Jacinto, operated for 5 years. We got tons of data, but still there is a lot we don't know, especially in relation to big earthquakes. So it's a long-term commitment, and we're going to need help from all of you. I mean, we need to come up with a plan. How do we have long-term commitment? I will only end by saying there are other such efforts in our business, the fault zone, fault physics. There are other such efforts that you cannot really address them without long-term commitments. So we are stuck again and again. We do something, it's sort of interesting, 5 years, 10 years, it's just not enough. We need to put these observatories on the ground with plan that they will operate for decades. And if we don't do that, until we do that, I'll reverse my sentence. Until we do that, we just don't get the data that we need to answer questions, basically. So we need to work on it, but it's a very, very challenging problem. On the other hand, the budget is not huge. The budget for us is very, very big for us, our community. But if you think in terms of, and there was a little article we wrote, if you think in terms of projects that the physics community come up with, the budget is really small. Or in the framework of California, budget, it's a small budget. So we need to get the commitment somehow for long-term observatory.
That, I think we all agree that that you specifically have this problem of running it for 50 years. I'm not. I'm more interested to look at the science and to try to make that interesting. And the only thing I can offer in terms of long-term interest is to make sure that it's an evolutionary process, that people are allowed to modify things as new things come up. That's how you retain interest in the scientific community. As long as there's interest in the scientific community, there's a sort of driver for people like you to get the money. I'm sort of handing you with that responsibility. Sorry.
No, but we are discussing, but it's all coupled, Roger. I agree. It has to be scientifically interested. What started this whole process are sets of unanswered questions that will not get an answer until we get the data first.
Right.
But now to go back to the long term, it's a very difficult prospect. We need an observatory, and if we are successful, while we are working on, let's say, some infrastructure funding to put the observatory on the ground, we are at the same time talking to some other agencies, state and federal, to try to ensure that there's a continuation. Otherwise, there is no point. So yes, it could be evolutionary. We need stream of continuing science questions, and we need to do what other communities are doing, like physics. We need to figure out how do we come together and come up with hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billion-dollar projects, or else we just don't get the data, period. That's where we are. We are I wrote a little paper. I said near vacuum, in situ constraints. That's where we are, really. We have something we don't, very little, sort of, everything is case study. Everything is some anecdotal event here. It's getting better with time. There's enormous effort put by people who are participating here. But you all agree, we all are in agreement that it's just not enough, I think. We just don't have the data that can constrain processes. So we count on all of you to help finding ways that together we could come up with some long-term plan, because the community needs it. We are a science that is extremely low on in situ data. That's the reality. If we could have, astronomers are much more successful. Physicists, they also, they were successful in launching incredible observatories, and we will be in the situation we are until we manage to develop some observatories. This is reality. I don't have magic solutions.
We've had some success, Yehuda. Think about NODA and the GSN.
Yeah, we have. No. Things I don't want to argue that there's not been a progress. There has been significant progress. EarthScope,
no, in terms of funding, like NODA is going to go on its third decade. The GSN, it's longer, and there's been committed multi-agency funding. That model you're talking about has worked for expensive networks.
Right. So we have some good examples. I agree with you, Dave. And we need to. This is for earthquake science. What we are discussing here in near fault. I don't know. We are trying. It's all I can say. But to go back to Dan's question, there's one effort to develop and install the observatory, but that will not solve the problem if we don't have a plan, longer-term plan, how to sustain it, including replacing instruments. You mentioned this, Dave, evolving instruments, Roger mentioned, all of the above, and getting funding, commitment of funding from the state of California or the USGS or anyone else to absorb this observatory and integrate it, to make it just part of the ongoing monitoring effort. If we continue to just monitor earthquakes with regional networks, seismic and geodetic, we are losing all the detailed information in the regional network. They are great, so I don't want to give them up, but the high frequency information doesn't propagate to the far field, and we will always have this blurry average vision. That's it. This is just
a question, Yehuda. The next Parkfield earthquake, dare I say it, is coming up. What about putting your eggs in that particular basket to show the sort of thing you want to happen? Some people have said that earthquake is going to happen in 4 years. Some people say in 40, but it's we've got a history there. What about?
So the answer is that it's only one spot, and it's an unusual spot, but actually every one location is unusual. So we don't learn enough. This is a very heterogeneous system, as you highlighted, and maybe Dave, we cannot learn enough, never, if we learn enormous amount on one spot. This is an extended system, and we need to sample the heterogeneity of behavior. So I don't want to put all the eggs in the basket in just one spot. Any one spot is very unusual. Parkfield is very unusual. It's a very, very interesting transition between creep and luck. It's great, but one spot. So no, we need to.
Okay, let me attack your sorry, let me discuss with you the previous supposition was, the physicists can get money for looking for bosons, and the astronomers can get money for looking at the beginning of the universe. What is our target? We need something that has a similar kind of awe-inspiring meaning for everybody.
Right. So our targets are two levels here. One, on a fundamental level, earthquakes for decades now are considered to be a prime example of a complex, nonlinear, dissipative process that is not well understood, with many degrees of freedom, multi-scale, and all the rest, on one level. On the other level, the earthquake problem is the most relevant to society, more relevant than the bosons. These are great questions, and looking deep into space and time is fantastic questions. But in terms of relevance to society in the next 100 years, NASA had this great experiment colliding the DART, colliding a satellite with an asteroid. The idea was this generates a lot of excitement. The idea was that there is some probability that asteroids will, come to Earth. So the probability for that is so small relative to the probability of large damaging earthquake is essentially in the next 100 years is 1. So I'm saying there are two levels. On the fundamental level, there are some really interesting questions for those that are interested in complex nonlinear dynamics. But then there is the issue of benefit to society.
Yeah, I understand that. Let me just cut you a little bit short and say you need to be able to have a one sentence phrase, and it mustn't use the word complexity or something like that. It needs to be well, the obvious one is we are going to predict an earthquake. That's what people want. Now, we know we can't do it, but what can we offer them that's in that direction, but as briefly stated? Yeah.
All right. So we sort of did this, Roger. I welcome your suggestion how to motivate it. And when we write a proposal, everybody can contribute. But we have this opinion piece again that we said what you are just describing now, that we hope to improve the ability to predict. We cannot promise, but sure. The more we know, we have models. The models are not constrained because we don't have near field data. So there is some kind of a positive feedback loop between models and data, but only if we get the data. The situation today is we don't have the data. So we need to begin by getting the data, showing richness of signals that are not included in current thinking, try to incorporate them into models, and keep on moving upward in the spiral rather than just going in circles. Right now we have models that work okay from the far field, but they don't predict anything.
So just to add to that, you talking there about trying to improve predictions of possible events, but what about selling it also as a monitoring earthquake early warning tool?
Yeah,
is that another means to, as a way of selling it to society, the way to?
So the observatory will of course contribute also to early warning because it's the earliest. The signals are the instruments are very close to the fault, so this plate boundary fault. So it's very early. Plus, they will pin down on which fault actually the signal is. It's actually difficult to determine from far field data, and it will also give you directivity, all of the above. So that's another benefit, yes, that we,
Yeah, it seems like a natural idea because you don't have to justify, waiting for the next big one. It's there in order to make sure we're ready for the next big one. Anyway, so sorry, I got to cut you off. There's one quick question from Joanne, and I think after that we should wrap up because we're over time. So Joanne made a little comment here asking about we need to collaborate with ecologists who study changes in humidity or soil gas affecting plant roots, set up arrays to monitor plant root systems, and then see if there is any detectable change, for example, precursor or co-seismic related to creep or slip events along known fault strands. Anybody know anyone doing this? Is the question. So idea is to try and maybe open up our collaboration with different groups. Okay, doesn't look like it. So anyway, I think that's a great discussion. I think we do need to wrap it up now though, because we are over. So I'll pass it over to Casey, who will close the session. Thanks, everyone.
All right, thanks everyone. And yeah, just to go back to Joanne's comment, I do think that we need to think broad too in communities that we're engaging, think about, utilities, other impacts that can be met with such observations along fault. So thanks for bringing that up, Joanne. All right, and thank you everyone for joining us. To Chris and Roger for organizing, Andrea and David and Roger again for your presentations, all the great comments that were made and questions that were brought up. The recording of this session will be made available on the IRIS Earthquake Science playlist. If you are interested in future community near fault observatory breakout sessions and other events, please do check out our website in the link provided in the chat. And thank you very much.